But it's fantastic to be here amongst friends, especially at this 8 a.m. time slot on Tuesday. When if you're like me, you're mildly or severely hungover, and the best part of these meetings is seeing old friends and catching up with their work and everything about what's been happening to them, and that's when I think really great things happen at these meetings. But yet the 8 a.m. session maybe is not the most productive. So my name is Richard Joe. I work for the Nature Conservancy, and I'm the state director here in Montana. And I don't get to do much science anymore. As state director, I'm basically a middle manager and sort of an overeducated fundraiser. Because yesterday someone asked the panel, what is a conservation scientist? Which I thought was a pretty legitimate question. I wondered myself, do I still really qualify for this? But I'm grateful that at least I was able to be on this panel, so I guess I still barely make it over that bar. But I was really struck yesterday by the passion and energy that grad students really put into their work, sometimes on pretty obscure topics. But sometimes on very, very important and critical topics. But it doesn't matter. But just that energy and passion gives me a huge amount of optimism. And I hope everybody here has some sort of internal model or vision. Either whether it be personal ambition or organizational or whatever, about how we can make positive changes in how humans interact with nature. Whether that's rewilding or whole system conservation or changing how the planet feeds itself or driving deep social change for sustainability, all these different ways to approach the problems we all are here to think about and care, things that we care about. And if you're like me, if you think about these things and your imagination is big enough, at some point it will require you to implement across political boundaries, across national boundaries, and that's what this symposium is all about. Nature, we all know nature does not respect political boundaries. Yet it's sort of a conundrum. Most of us tend to work in a single political setting, and I dare say most of us here work in the United States. Yet we know sort of intellectually that this sort of cross-border work is necessary. For a number of years I was the director of the Nature Conservancy's Canada program, and I can tell you, Canadians tend to work in Canada, Americans tend to work in the US. In part, it's because it's hard work, to work across these boundaries. It's at least twice as much work. But I think what we'll see today from these case studies will give us some insight. If you do this right, and you're committed to it, it can pay off, and sometimes in a multiplicative fashion greater than the twice as much work that it really is. And this photo just is one of my favorite transboundary regions in the world. This is in the Taku River looking west over the Southeast Alaska Panhandle. And it also reminds me to introduce Dr. Dave Secord, who has agreed to sort of co-moderate the panel. We thought that we would, instead of having lots of speakers just do a very thin presentation, we'd have a couple of speakers do a deeper presentation about transboundary issues, some transboundary projects that have had some success. But I was thinking, I'm not always the best moderator, so Dave's graciously agreed at the last minute to help sort of do this. And Dave has a very last minute, like yesterday. And this is because I realized Dave has a great background for this. He's a Bob Payne student, PhD at University of Washington, went all the way through and was a faculty member there. But then he switched over to implementation and worked for the Wilberforce Foundation as a funder for a number of years, and now works for the Tides Canada Foundation. And one of Dave's roles has been to work on and implement and devise funding mechanisms to implement cross-border conservation work. So, his brain can really help us here. And, our other panelists, Karsten Heuer, is that how you say your name? Close enough. Close enough. He's president of Y2Y for about a year and a half, and he came from Parks Canada, but Karsten's also a filmmaker. And an author and adventurer. So very interesting guy, and Y2Y is one of the sort of kind of best examples of how to do transboundary work. And then we also have Ron Pulliam, retired landscape ecologist from University of Georgia, and now lives 12 miles from the Arizona-Mexico border. We won't say which side. But you know, Ron works hard on these borderlands issues, and especially with the local communities in issues around habitat and water and so forth. So Ron and Karsten will give these case studies. So I think it's a critically important topic, and I hope the panel today will stimulate discussion and thought. You know, I hope that it might inspire you as grad students or faculty members or conservation scientists or practitioners to think harder about strategy, especially cross-border strategy. Yeah, I think science can play a key role and can unify work across borders, but you know, this session is much less about the science and more about how science can guide conservation strategy. And that's really what we want to do, is explore strategies. You know, how would these various situations, these case studies that we're presented with, how would they change if the situation changed? We want to generalize this sort of thinking so that it can be applicable to any conservation project or any conservation approach or issue anywhere. You know, so in this sort of philosophical design towards developing better and more effective cross-border strategies, you know, I'll ask the panel to think about, and the audience to think about these case studies you hear about first in terms of this idea of necessity, of imperative. Under what conditions is there an imperative to work across a border? You know, for example, if you care about waterfowl and want to conserve waterfowl populations, there's no way to do that in just a single geography or in a single place. There's an obvious imperative, a necessity to build these sort of bigger social, political, institutional constructs, these relationships across political jurisdictions and boundaries. So the Migratory Bird Treaty of 1918 between the US and Canada, you know, later added Mexico, Japan, Russia, it's a great example of how working across borders was imperative and it was successful. You know, there's a number of other examples of these sorts of treaties, you know, where it's obvious that you really need to sort of cross these national boundaries, you know, sort of the Interagency Grizzly Bear Commission, for example, or the International Commission for the Conservation of Atlantic Tuna. You know, these wide-ranging species that are sensitive and, you know, really need common management. But, you know, at the same time, to do that, to work cross borders, even, you know, to even think about these sort of big treaties or big agreements, you know, it's a huge amount of work and a huge amount of investment. And really just a subset of the work that needs to be done. You know, and furthermore, it doesn't really always make sense financially or strategically to do that. You know, and, you know, perhaps sometimes we get the sense that what's needed is really a community, bottom-up effort, you know, across borders. That this work should be coordinated locally, sometimes just go on independently on both sides of a national border without a lot of this big fanfare. So where there is some imperative or necessity to work across a national border, what are the conditions for success? So we decide that, yes, we really feel that something needs to happen. You know, then further, you know, how do we decide to go on? How do we change those conditions? What do we need to do strategically? You know, and then finally, of course, what lessons can we learn from these case studies we're exploring? So, since I'm both a moderator and a panelist, I'm going to try to illustrate these points, sort of necessity and conditions for success, and different strategies in two contrasting stories. First is the Crown of the Continent, shown here. You know, it's sort of obvious that to protect the Crown, you have to work across the international boundary. The 10 million Crown of the Continent spans Montana, BC, and Alberta. You know, in many ways, this was the birthplace of the sort of environmental movement of the West. You know, it really still drives the consciousness of how we think about conservation here. It's got these great protected areas, Glacier and Waterton, Bob, Marshall Wilderness Area. And so many people have worked for decades to protect this place. Private land conservation in Montana was also pioneered here, and the Nature Conservancy's first easement was done down here in the Blackfoot River, which became the Blackfoot Community Project and Blackfoot Challenge, and really has driven how the Nature Conservancy thinks about community-based conservation in private lands, especially those that surround these ecological core areas. And it's been successful by many measures. The Crown's a better place today, ecologically, socially, tolerance for wildlife, all these things that we're discussing at this meeting, than it was 20 years ago. It's a great place and getting better. So Canada's North Fork of the Flathead is one of the lesser known but a critical area of the Crown. That watershed encompasses about 400,000 acres of largely intact headwaters. So, sorry, a little out of order, but that's up here, this 400,000 acre chunk that's just west of Waterton. And the North Fork flows and forms the western boundary of Glacier Park and flows into Flathead Lake. And despite the rich history of conservation in the region, and the North Fork's obvious ecological importance, it's just a gem ecologically. There's many people in this room that could just go on about how great it is, and they're right. It's north-south orientation is important for connectivity of, grizzly bears and wolverines and lynx and wolves. It's a place of high plant diversity, surprisingly, amazingly high plant diversity. It's one of the only intact headwaters of the Columbia, the Great Columbia River. But yet, for the past 3 decades, it was hugely threatened, and not just by logging or a little bit of development or, these small threats, but by huge threats, by mountaintop removal coal mining. And this specter was hanging over the Flathead for, like I say, decades. And for these decades, lots of smart, creative, strategic people, even high-level people, politicians, worked to stop this mountaintop removal coal mining proposal. Both sides of the border. And they put all this passion, creativity, energy, and science into this to create the conditions where it was possible to stop this threat. It took a couple decades. And I'll tell you a little bit about this story from my own personal perspective, which omits many of the work that's been done, but it is my story because it's my one and only foray into big politics. So what happened here was that in 2010, Gordon Campbell was the Premier of British Columbia. His numbers were horrible, dismal. And he went to a Western Governors Conference, and he was inspired by Arnold Schwarzenegger, who was then Governor of California, his vision for climate change. He came back and he said, I'm going to green myself. I'm going to reboot my administration, and we're going to do some great environmental things. And the 2010 Winter Olympics were in Vancouver, and Campbell decided, well, what we need is a big announcement at this Olympics. So he and the then governor of Montana, Brian Schweitzer, cooked up this deal where BC would end mining in the Flathead, and essentially the US would pay for it. And they stood on the podium and announced this binational agreement between British Columbia and the state of Montana to end mining, mineral activity in the Flathead. Yet they had no, this is a premier and a governor, and this is really an international treaty when it comes down to it. They really didn't have the full legal authority to do this. And, Schweitzer had promised money for it to compensate these mining companies that, had real investment here. And, he didn't really have access to that money either. But yet, declared success at the Olympics, moving on. So a year later, I get a phone call. At the time I was running the Nature Conservancy's Canada program, and it's my old friend Rhea Sue on the line. And Rhea, who is now working for Interior, said, Richard, what's going on in the Flathead? I said, well, as far as I know, the thing has been protected. Things look good. But Rhea then went on to tell me that no, in fact, this agreement is going south. It's going to fall apart. What we really need from you is, when it comes down to it, what we really need from you in the Nature Conservancy is $50 or $60 million. Can you come through on that? So I said, Rhea, we just went through the biggest, economic downturn in the Conservancy as well, and that's probably not going to happen. But I would love to go and talk to all these agency folks and mining people and the province and see what's really going on there. So we did that, and it turned out that this agreement really was about to go. And I told Rhea, well, 50 is a non-starter in this era, but we could probably help with a smaller number. So some time passes, and they come back, and it's 20. And I said, well, wait a minute, how does it go from 50 to 20 just like that? We need some documentation. So some more time passes, and they finally come in at $9.5 million of receipted sunk costs for exploration. And we say, oh, that's getting more in the ballpark. We can maybe do half. And we cut an agreement with the Canadian federal government that they would move money through the Nature Conservancy of Canada, our a separate Canadian-based organization that shares our same name in Canada. And we were working on this deal to basically finalize, through legislation, the Flathead mineral withdrawal. So, it all was looking great, but then, these politicians start weighing in, and Brian Schweitzer starts getting nervous and impatient. So he starts to push and say, well, why aren't you guys just getting this done? Gordon and I, we've solved this. You guys just need to come up with the money. Why are you just, what are all these details? And I think the peak of the deal was I was on a Sunday morning, I was driving to some 5K run walk race with my family. And my phone rings just as I was getting out of the car, and it's the province, and they start in on trying to renegotiate the parameters of the deal and everything. And I said, well, I guess I was in a bad mood because they were calling me on a Sunday, and I was in a hurry. And I said, well, I guess we don't have a deal. Deal's off. Hung up the phone. Thinking, I'm a really smart negotiator here. So I come back, and I had 25 messages on my phone. Ending with Brian Schweitzer, on a 10 out of 10, he was a full 10. Himself, saying, you guys just better get this done. And the long and the short of it was that, we got past that, and, we actually finally got the deal done, and we raised the money, and it went from an MOU to a legislative withdrawal of all mineral activity. So, through this sort of high-level, really very opportunistic political wrangling, that again is sort of riding on the coattails of all this passion and effort. And the drive of these politicians wasn't just their own ethics, it was the people who had been pushing for the protection of this place for the last 25 or 30 years. So that's one story of how binational conservation can move forward. I'll tell you another story that's much different. So if we move east from the Crown, whoops, sorry, technically challenged. We move east from the Crown to the the northern Montana plains, sort of here north of Glasgow and Malta, stretching up to the Montana-Canada border. Much different, not that physically far away, but a much different situation. There it's cattle country, sort of a mix of private, federal and state ownership. But also the best examples of grassland habitat are found out here on private land. And our strategy here, like elsewhere in Montana, is very community-based. We work with landowners to keep their ranches whole and manage human activities to be compatible with wildlife. And we're guided by a suite of grassland birds that really depend on intact grassland habitats, untilled habitats, things like sage grouse, long-billed curlew, Sprague's pipit. But also, we depend on wide-ranging mammals such as pronghorn to guide this work. And this slide shows our Matador Ranch. This is this beautiful 60,000-acre ranch that we run as a grass bank. And we leverage another 250,000 acres of conservation through incentives for ranchers to do conservation and wildlife-friendly practices on their ranches. A key species here is pronghorn. Pronghorn migrate hundreds of miles, and although they don't really jump fences. They like to go under. They're very sensitive to fragmentation, especially in winter. So they're sort of hypersensitive to sort of management conditions and range conditions, especially around fences. And we focus some of our strategies on testing and providing incentives, through this grass bank and other ways, for compatible ranching practices, like fence removal and installation of wildlife-friendly fences, removing woven wire, removing the bottom wire, lots of sort of just nuts and bolts on the ground work, face-to-face with ranchers. But pronghorn move these vast distances, hundreds of miles, and this is work by Andrew Jakes at the University of Calgary that is unpublished as part of his PhD thesis. So it's pretty evident that the strategy to conserve pronghorn across ranches and across this Canadian border, both sides of the border, will require a much different kind of effort than it took to eliminate the threat of coal mining in the Flathead. While there's a similar need, a necessity, sort of an imperative to work across the border to preserve pronghorn, the strategy is much different. The Flathead was largely political, and here it's much more of a problem of how local resource users develop and implement management, regulations, working across borders, things like hunting seasons, fences, management, really makes a difference, as a whole to this population. So community-based conservation here is necessary, but it's made harder by this national border. It's really hard to do this on both sides. So how do we think about these two, very close geographies physically, but very, very different strategically? Well, one framework that myself and the Nature Conservancy has really been adopting is the late great Eleanor Ostrom framework for socio-ecological systems. And this really helps, at least in my mind, sort of visualize where we put our efforts and what we're trying to do. Sort of just a framework to help us, just guide strategy and evaluate strategy, and hopefully where sort of knowledge can accumulate. So this is Ostrom's socio-ecological system in a nutshell. On the one hand, you have, let's see if I can use this pointer. Whoops. On the one hand, you have this sort of bigger social, economic, and political setting, the drivers, things like coal mining, things like international treaties, just the political setting. Then you have the resource you're interested in, and within that, there's users, there's the systems, there's governance, there's the resources themselves, and there's interactions between those. It's a very simple, straightforward way to think about it. Under some conditions, like when users have good leadership, knowledge, good social capital between themselves, there's local autonomy of decision making, there's desire for sustainability amongst this community, that Ostrom has demonstrated that self-organizing sustainable systems can sort of result. And furthermore to that, that tells us we can help incentivize sustainable sort of management at that level, at this sort of resource level. But still we have to keep in mind these bigger drivers. And the thing we really want to keep in mind is the necessity, the imperative. What are the ecosystem outcomes we want? In the Flathead, we wanted this sort of almost aesthetic. We wanted this place to remain intact, pristine, part of the beautiful crown of the continent. For pronghorn in the east, we were fully practical. We want to just figure out how ranching can coexist with this wide-ranging species. So for pronghorn, it's really much more about this working with users and governance systems. But this is made much more difficult when you slap an international border between, because you have differing socioeconomic and political settings on both sides, and you have separate users, resource, and governance systems on both sides, managing the same resource, using the same resource. And you can see how many times that can result in a tragedy of the commons. because everyone just wants to take what they have when it's on their side of the border. So much of the strategies we'll hear today is really about how do you differentiate, or how do you sequence, this stuff. Do you really put together these things, or do you drive forward from the bottom and use that to drive the political and social setting? And finally, just keeping in mind, what are these big ecosystem outcomes we want from this? So with that sort of framing in mind, I'll turn it over to Karsten to walk us through Y2Y and associated strategies.
Thanks, Richard, and good morning, everybody. My name is Karsten Heuer. I'm the president of the Yellowstone to Yukon Conservation Initiative. Thanks. And I think probably most of you know what Yellowstone to Yukon is. I won't go into a lot of detail. Hang on. Richard set me up here with my last slide. Yeah, no, very. Great, looks the same. So I don't think I need to go into a lot of detail. We work to connect and protect habitat from Yellowstone to Yukon so people and nature can thrive. And really it's taking going beyond the old model of trying to protect just individual reserves and trying to have a reserve network instead. Over a pretty massive landscape, 500,000 square miles, 2,200 miles if you go from south to north. And you all thought you came to Montana, but I'm actually here to say welcome to the Y2Y region. And we're really talking about this trans-border part of the region today. And Richard really framed it well, I think, in saying that it's about twice the work when you start to introduce boundaries like this and you're trying to generate outcomes. Which begs the question, why? Why go to all that extra effort? And he touched on it a little bit, but it's almost 20 years ago now where a collection of people, some of whom are in this room, kind of gathered around this idea of Yellowstone to Yukon, this vision. And really it was because different things were telling them to. The movements of animals, like a wolf that ventured over 120,000 square kilometers, a lynx that went from the central Yukon into central BC, 1,100 kilometers straight line distance, bull trout that in northern BC are moving 1,500 kilometers. These animals are saying constantly, think bigger, think larger, think beyond political boundaries. And then the history of extinction, if you will, or range contraction, and these patterns of fragmentation and islands, and then those islands winking out, really a different kind of approach needs to come about to try to create an antidote to that extinction. And so that's another thing that's driving these trans-border initiatives. And then looking ahead into the future, and all the indications are we need to think more and more about these large landscape initiatives and connecting across international borders if we're to have any hope for providing nature the ability to adapt to both existing and coming climate change. And then in the Y2Y region, it's the opportunity that we have as well. And we're probably sitting in here today one of the best global opportunities to conserve all the native suite of large carnivores, large ungulates, and we're really sitting in an opportunity that doesn't exist hardly anywhere else in the world anymore. And so we certainly see this as a geography of hope, and where we're not having to engage in huge, widespread habitat restoration, but a lot of it's about planning in a way that we keep what we already have. I mean, certainly there's some focused restoration required. And so how we do this at Yellowstone to Yukon, we work in different thematic areas. Today I'm going to talk in 3 little case studies about some private land conservation, some of our public land protected areas efforts, a little bit about habitat restoration as well. And you'll notice, I don't know if you can read each of these sort of sentences under each of these headings, but there's the word we that begins with all of them. And And we're a staff of 14 people. We have an office in Missoula, an office in Canmore, and a new office in northern BC. But there's only so much that we can do on the ground, and really the initiative is about piecing together this puzzle work, if you will, of locally based initiatives and efforts so that there's a cohesion and it has meaning at the scale at which nature thinks. And so we've worked over the last 20 years with over 300 partners, and many of whom are in this room, and countless other partners that didn't even know, that we don't know about, and that didn't even quite frankly know that their efforts have been contributing to the Y2Y vision. And let me just pause to say, thank you to everybody, because this is what I like to term, one of the world's largest group projects. And I'm going to show a few things to just sort of say how much we're succeeding. We're coming up to our 20th anniversary this fall as a vision, and it's a collective vision. And when we look at where we were when this was first articulated in 1993, this was the map, and I'm just sharing some draft images here as we're putting together this work for our celebration in Waterton in September. But the dark green areas were existing protected areas, many of which you'll recognize. The yellow areas we're sort of terming them, there's sort of a lighter touch of protection, and we're terming them connectivity. So it was about 10% of the region was fully protected 20 years ago, and this is where we're at today. And so again, this is due to the efforts of so many people in this room. And for me, this is, what this, despite the audaciousness of this vision, despite the challenges of working across borders, this to me is a very great visual representation of that it is possible, and we're well on the road towards achieving this 100-year vision and really capitalizing on this amazing opportunity that we're sitting in right here in Missoula. So let's talk a little bit about this, some of the progress we've made right along that line, the medicine line. Also some people term it the largest one-way mirror in the world. I noticed Richard didn't have Waterton National Park in Canada on any of his maps, which is a very common thing. And I'm going to briefly go through three examples. One is in the Cabinet Purcells. I'm going to talk about some of our private land initiatives. Then moving along that line east, I'm going to talk a little bit more about the Flathead. Richard did a great job of setting that up. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about sort of work in progress in Alberta. So let's start with the Cabinet Purcells, and I'm going to kind of zoom way out for a minute, because all our work is informed by science. And I think a lot of you are familiar with the work of Michael Proctor, grizzly bear biologist, and had that sort of seminal paper, Wildlife Monograph in 2012, where he looked at a lot of the telemetry from almost 800 bears throughout a lot of the Y2Y region. He looked at over 3,000 grizzly bear DNA, and he started to map out all the different subpopulations of grizzly bears, and really started to focus in on that area of fragmentation, kind of where the range has been eaten away in the southern part of the range in northwestern Montana and Idaho, and then southern BC as well. And from that work, we started to see that if we want to keep these animals and try to prevent that pattern of extinction from creeping north, but also set it up for expanding down into places like the Idaho Wilderness Complex, we really need to have some strategic work across the border to try to pull that off. And so this is zooming in on that area now, and what Dr. Proctor started to do was to highlight individual, these are in the dark green, individual linkage zones that he saw as critical based on his telemetry research that needed to be conserved if we were going to both maintain the connectivity that was there now, but set up these animals for actually starting to expand south. So you see all these dark green areas, and then as a conservation organization working at a similar scale, we started to work with Dr. Proctor and started to identify a whole suite of private land parcels throughout the region, both sides of the border, that essentially created this list for us that we then started to engage with, the Trust for Public Land, Vital Ground on the U.S. side of the border, 2 land trusts, and then the Nature Conservancy and the BC Land Trust on the north side of the border, and then went out and started working on trying to secure these lands. Let's look at the last one I brought up and kind of zooming in. This is an area we call Frog Bear Conservation Corridor. This is sort of a close-up of what we're looking at here is the south end of Kootenay Lake in BC. Creston is about just down here, and the U.S. border would kind of be down on the floor here, so not too far. And all those spaghetti patterns are the movements of Dr. Proctor's grizzly bears, and they all started to really highlight a key linkage zone linking the Purcell mountain range on this side with the Selkirk mountain range over here, which is an isolated population of bears, but it's also an isolated population of mountain caribou. And you also happen to have an endangered leopard frog, so you had this beautiful convergence of multiple values. Well, this was first identified about a decade ago, and I'm happy to be standing up here now to say, we've now secured with our partners over 95% of this valley bottom corridor. And I was just there in May, and there literally was a big male grizzly bear hunkered down in the corridor while I was there. So, again, this whole idea of the big picture, zooming in on specific parcels of land, and the way we were able to raise the money there was by leveraging this story of an international issue. This is important not just for the Creston Valley, this is important not just for linking the Purcells to the Selkirks, but this is actually important at the continental scale of maintaining grizzly bear and caribou populations. And that was the narrative that we could go out with and raise money in the US for a Canadian piece of property. And again, so that's one of the powers of this transborder work, specifically when it comes down to private land. So let's just hop over now to the Flathead and somewhat of a different situation. Our kind of blueprint in terms of what we were shooting for conservation was created much through the work of the Wildlife Conservation Society and sort of the RSF modeling and other habitat modeling done by John Weaver. So again, driven by science, and then just looking at the history of this watershed, it all starts back in the early 1900s when on the U.S. side there was, with the establishment of Glacier National Park, a lot of the North Fork of the Flathead was protected. Meanwhile, on the north side of the border, it essentially was, as Richard illustrated, essentially was treated as an industrial landscape. It became an issue because what was happening here was actually being carried in the water of the Flathead River itself down south of the border, and it created this dynamic of concern on the south side of the border for management practices on the north. And that essentially was what started driving and brought together, Premier Campbell and Schweitzer to hammer out that first MOU back in 2010. And that was successful. Richard gave you some of the details in securing over 400,000 acres out of taking out the mining and oil and gas. And now we're sort of, there's this dynamic of almost a seesaw of effects in terms of conservation. We've built on that in the last year and actually partnered with the coal mining company in southern BC, Teck, and they sort of stepped up and took some global leadership and actually helped secure 3 parcels of private land which are critical to this whole connectivity, a deal that cost them $19 million, and that's for nature conservation as well. And then now there's sort of pending in the Senate, the US Senate, is the North Fork Watershed Protection Act, which is trying to do on the south side of the border now what was achieved with Minister Campbell and Schweitzer and the Nature Conservancy and other partners on the north. And so that's pending, and a lot of fingers are crossed right now. And then on the Canadian side, we're also wrapping a lot and continuing to try to build on what's been achieved so far. We have a national park proposal and a campaign to forward that in the BC portion in yellow there. And then also a whole wildlife management area, which essentially would function as a wildlife corridor all the way up to the next big block of protected area, the Banff Jasper National Park Complex in Canada, and that zone would also have 3 more wilderness areas in it as well. And so you can kind of see this seesaw of action back and forth and a sort of political matching of initiatives around the cohesion of this what originally started as a trans-border water issue that has now encompassed the entire watershed. So some great leverage points there and some great work on behalf of a lot of our partners. And then, you know, the final story I want to tell is how trans-border work, in my mind, can actually catalyze creativity at times. And so let's go over to the same map here, but let's go to this region just over the BC-Alberta border, an area that we call the Castle watershed. It has a lot of the same watershed values as the Flathead, but for communities down, not in the States, but communities downstream in the sort of most drought and flood-prone part of Alberta. And the big issue in the Castle, and it's an area that's been highlighted, part of a 30-year campaign for protection, the big issue there is trying to get a logging company out. And it's a bit of a hang-up at the moment. And we started to look at a couple different things across a couple different borders. First of all, I know this is called Across National Borders, this symposium, but I'm going to sneak in a provincial border here. We looked at what we were able to achieve with Teck, the coal mining company, on the BC side, and wondering, you know, is there an equivalent of an industrial player that we can pull into this equation on the Alberta side? And then we also started to look south of the border, and, you know, if you go through an animation on Google Earth over the last 20 years of what the forest looks like in this unprotected part of the border, or this unprotected part on the US side versus this unprotected part on the Canadian side, you actually see this greening up of the forest and roads disappearing over time on the Montana side, and you actually see just a plethora of roads being punched in and a lot more clear cuts on the Canadian side. So there's this disconnect in management practices. And a lot of Wide-A-Wide's work on the US side of the border, along with our partners, is actually removing roads and restoring the habitat. This is Rebecca Lloyd, our Missoula-based conservation director for the US, with some heavy machinery where they're actually recontouring and restoring an old roadbed. And that money, or the way that work has been done, has mostly been through funding that's been released through the Endangered Species Act, federal funding that's in terms flowing because of habitat recovery initiatives. We don't have anything like that on the Canadian side. And so we started thinking, well, how could we replicate that, though, and make the same argument where you're actually creating a restoration economy where you are employing, you know, sometimes the same logging companies like Pyramid Lumber in Montana, and sometimes the same contractors to actually work in the same landscape, but instead of pulling the timber out, they're actually doing restoration work. How could we find those funds in Alberta? We also have an existing land use planning process in Alberta, so we had this political opening as well. So again, the question was how to sort of incentivize Spray Lake sawmills, not necessarily to get out of business in the Castle, but how to change their business in the Castle. And we essentially approached Shell, who has a major gas field in the area and a long history, and started to weave this story around conservation offsets, and started to sort of broker that conversation and bring together a proposal where Shell would actually finance both the Spray Lake sawmills to not go in and cut the timber that they had remaining, but also to fund a restoration fund to actually keep many of those same contractors employed. That's sort of something that's in play right now as we speak, and I don't know where it's going to go, but it was interesting for me working with my team and the various partners to kind of see this shift happen where we were picking and borrowing from other trans-border issues to find those leverage points to creatively come up with a solution that actually might get some on-the-ground results for the Castle and the broader transboundary region of Wide-A-Wide. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Richard to introduce our next speaker.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here. I know Joan Baez is going to be here 2 nights from now, and probably some of you have come a little early to get your seats. but I hope that, that we can say some things that maybe are not quite as entertaining, but at least inspire and give people hope. I was really pleased to hear the word hope come up in the last presentation. My co-author, Valère Austin, myself, our presentation is called Hope in the Borderlands, and we're talking about the U.S.-Mexico borderlands. Now, this is where we live, and this is where we, every day, face challenges. I live 12 miles from the U.S.-Mexico border. This is the border wall. You can see the road along the border wall. When I go out to my study sites, 3/4 of the vehicles that I see are Border Patrol vehicles. This is an environment which is difficult to work in. The fine print that you can't read at the top basically quotes the legislation that says that the Attorney General can dismiss the laws of the Land, Endangered Species Act, and NEPA do not apply to this area. It's a difficult area to work in for a great variety of reasons. I lived in this area in the 1970s. I moved away, came back 35, 40 years later, and many of the places that I had remembered had changed, and not changed in the best of ways. This is a photograph taken a couple of miles from my house. It's the intersection of two streams which used to run year-round. It is called Camp Crittenden because it was the site of a camp where the biggest issue in the camp was malaria. I don't think you have to worry about malaria at this place anymore. And what we continually find is people have forgotten. To me, it's like you were to come back here 100 years from now, and the Clark Fork was dry. And it went dry so slowly that no one really noticed. Now, that might be totally unimaginable to you, and probably is in today's culture and context. But the oldest people in the town I live in, Patagonia, Arizona, can remember walking to school and having to ford 3 creeks on the way, a mile and a half to go to school. Most people now will either tell you it's always been this way, even if they grew up in the area, it's always been this way in their lifetime, or if they admit that this change has occurred, they'll say there's nothing you can do about it. Well, we're trying to change those attitudes. And part of that is simply a matter of representing things that we've known for a long time. And this is where we do go back in terms of the historical record. And this is a kind of a funny graph to look at, but it has, I think, some compelling information. I went back and looked at all of the USGS gauging stations which had data prior to 1930. And this is one of them. There were 6 that in our area met the criteria of the time frame we were looking at, and 5 of the 6 looked like this, and the one that didn't is where a sewage treatment plant has brought some of the stream water back. The way you can read this graph is going up on the left are the months from January to December, and on the x-axis are the years from about 1920 to the present. The white means there's no data. Okay? The blue means the creek was running sometime during that month. Now, this is whitewater draw. We found data like this for 6 different creeks and rivers in the area. The pattern is the same. Until about 1960, you find no months of the year that are dry. After about 1960, in essence, you have a total shift of the physical environment, with the blue only occurring during the summer monsoons. And what you're getting are these huge runoffs during the monsoon of flood water, and you're getting drought the rest of the year. And this has had, of course, a major impact on not just the animals and plants in the area, but on the economy of the area. The other little graph at the bottom is the same data, and just simply plotted as the number of months of year that the creek doesn't run, this particular whitewater draw in this example. So I think that a lot of wisdom, of course, in Dr. Zeus. I think he was quoted yesterday morning as well. Unless someone like you who cares a whole awful lot, nothing's going to get better. It's not. Well, luckily there are people who care, and here are a couple of them, Joe and Valère Austin, and Valère is my co-author. The scale of what I'm going to talk about is bringing things down a little bit. To me, this is a big scale. We're talking about these two people who own 200,000 acres of land. We're very interested in the whole connection from the Sierra Madre to the Rockies, but most of what we do is a very much local scale. It's the scale of tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands of acres. And what I'm going to really talk about is more of a restoration focus. I spent about an hour yesterday at the poster session, and I was struck by a number of things, but one of the things that struck me is there was so little focus on restoration, and it was good to hear in the previous talk a mention of restoration. But in our area, where our creeks have dried up, where our rivers have dried up, where our wetlands are gone, where our wildlife has declined, we think it's all about restoration. I came to the session yesterday morning and afterwards went to the little roundtable discussion with the director of the Fish and Wildlife Service. And the director made the comment during the smaller group that we simply have to accept the fact that there's going to be less biodiversity in the future. There's going to be, his words were, there would be fewer, I think the examples he used were wolves and, what was the other? Wolves and spotted owls. But I don't accept that. And in our part of the world, things are so very degraded that I think a huge part of the future of biodiversity in this area is how do we bring back these very degraded areas and do it at a scale that actually has an impact on the viability of populations and the ability of people to coexist with nature in this area. What the Austins have done on their 200,000 acres is a very old technology of simply slowing the water down so that there's more infiltration. This is the San Bernardino Ranch to the east of Agua Prieta in northern Sonora, right on the US-Mexico border. And thousands, literally tens of thousands of small rock structures have been installed to slow the water down, and the results are absolutely dramatic in terms of the changes. I'm not going to go into that simply because there's very little time, except to say that there's 7 miles of the Rio San Bernardino, which is flowing again for the first time in about 100 years, and most of it is south of the area where the construction has occurred. This graph, you can see at the very top, the US-Mexico border, see Highway 2, and you can see where many of the structures have been put in, but the greening, the 2,000 hectares of new forest, the 7 miles of stream is south of that area. Valère Austin is the only person I know that has received a letter saying that she broke 2 international treaties, because she has created wetlands that now back up across the US-Mexico border. She's also the only person I know that on the US side, within the same week, has gotten an environmental award from one federal agency while being sued by another. So this kind of work does have its perils. What this graph doesn't show is that in addition to the 2,000 acres of new riparian forest, over 30,000 acres on this ranch alone, and this is only one of many ranches, over 30,000 acres of restored grassland, which is improving habitat both for wildlife and allowing people to make a living on the land with better grazing. Based on the success of the Austins and I and Gary Nabum and a number of other people started what we call the Borderlands Habitat Restoration Initiative. This initially was simply a matter collaboration between existing groups. We now have formed a new group that I'll mention very briefly as we go along, an umbrella to help things move ahead. But we built it based upon three ideas. That is that restoration, first depending on restoring the physical drivers that have changed things, in our case particularly stream flow, and doing it at a scale that really makes a difference. Secondly, restoring food chains, and we have a big focus on restoration of pollinators, but we generally focus on the base of the food chain. And our premise is that in our area, many species of plants and animals simply have disappeared locally, which are still available in the watersheds and available in the area, but we've broken those interrelationships between species. One of the things that drove us in terms of examples here, we worked very closely with Susan Wethington and the Hummingbird Monitoring Network, and she had many examples of hummingbirds starting their nesting cycle and then abandoning the chicks in the nest because there was plenty of nectar available early, but not late. So a lot of what we do is we identify what we call gaps in the food chain. We have our own greenhouses. We grow our own restoration plants. We actually make money growing restoration plants. And then we use them to try to fill the gaps in the natural area. But the most important thing we do is a very bottoms-up reconnecting people to the places where they live. And I'll say a little more about that where we go and the scale we do it. So I would summarize our situation in the area in southeastern Arizona and northern Sonora in particular as saying our rivers are drying up, our land and wildlife are in peril, our ranching economy is sinking, we're dealing with climate change, the border wall, illegal drugs, drought, poverty, and increasing violence. In short, there's never been a better time to build a restoration economy. A restoration economy is built on the recognition of the interdependence between people and the places where they live. The analogy I like to use is we think about the old robber barons and how all the money and the resources flowed into these central areas. This interest in pollination biology, think about a robber bee that sort of steals the nectar instead of doing the ecosystem service of the pollination. We want to shift that paradigm. We want to be able to use local resources. I forgot I had a robber baron slide here. So much of the wealth of this whole region has been built on overexploitation of resources and people who were able to make great fortunes and great wealth by degrading landscapes, taking the resources and turning them into wealth. I believe firmly that the degradation has gone so far that there's a real historic opportunity to make wealth by restoring areas and building a new economy based on biological wealth rather than mineral wealth and on the restoration of our natural resources. The bottom right is a group of Chihuahuan ranchers. In that group collectively, they probably own 3 million acres of land. That is a small rock dam that Valera Austin helped them build. And so these are the new barons. These are not the robber barons. These are people who are caring for their land and wanting to do something about it. And they were very proud, not that their workmen built this trinchera, but that they did. And they're carrying this back to their own ranches. What we're doing is we are restoring rivers based on the work of the Austins and the great success of bringing back the Rio San Bernardino. We were able to convince the Walton Foundation that the Babacami River, a tributary of the San Pedro, which is one of their focal rivers, was a similar sized river with similar kinds of problems. We've gotten some fairly major funding to restore the restoration, to restore the Babacami River. We've matched that with additional funds from other agencies and from local sources. We've told our funders this is a 10-year at least $10 million project. And we are not only restoring the river, but we're providing local income and local contribution to the restoration economy. Every day we have a work crew of 10 people that go out, 8 to 10 people that go out and work on this particular restoration project, which is just one of several that we're involved with. We're working very closely with the USGS and their modelers and bringing the science in, and we're using that as a way of trying to be more efficient about where we do our restoration work and where we get the biggest bang for the buck. We're also restoring food chains, and this is an example here with pollinator food chain with actually the hummingbird example I moved before. What we found is there's this great seasonality to when nectar is available, but there are plenty of plants that grow during the periods, the gaps, and we are identifying systematically the plants that produce nectar resources or other resources. We're very interested in frugivores. We're interested in a similar approach with the larval insects that are eaten by yellow-billed cuckoos. Can you do something that pieces together systematically through the year that brings back not individual species that you think might have been there or might not have been there, but brings back the function because there's always resource available, and you increase the local biodiversity by not just bringing back the water, but paying attention to the plants that are growing there. We also are very involved in identifying and protecting key corridors and key pieces of land, and the idea of working in protecting these lands in the context of working landscapes. This is just one example of something we're working on that may come to a head this week. This is a map of the housing density between Patagonia, Arizona, and Sonora, Arizona. There are 2 tracts of land, only about, between them, less than 3,000 acres. They go from Forest Service boundary to Forest Service boundary. It's the only land left. Immediately, I live within, I'm on this map here, and in my backyard are ocelots and the only jaguar in the U.S., and this is the way we believe they came into the U.S. is right through this little area. This particular tract of land has been identified by a study at NAU and Paul Bauer's group as the likely most important jaguar connection across this gap in the Forest Service lands, and we are in negotiations this week to try to purchase this land. I just tell one quick aside. I would have never guessed when I was the age of the younger presenters I've been hearing here today that I would now, as a theoretical landscape ecologist, be involved in land transactions and some of the other things you'll hear about in a minute, quail hunts and sustainable timber harvest, etc. My introduction to land transactions was buying my first house that I bought from the author Edward Abbey. When I went to, someone told me Ed Abbey's house was available. I went up and went to visit, and it was for rent. And I would knock on the door, and about 5 minutes later, this naked man comes around, having taken a shower out back, and said, "I'm Ed Abbey, can I help you?" To make a long story short, we rented the house for 5 years from Ed, and then we sold it. And when we sold it, I was off teaching a course in some remote area, and my wife was frantically trying to get to me because she got an offer on the house the very week that it was put up. Well, here I was, I couldn't be reached, I wasn't near a telephone in some remote area. Next day, another offer came in, so now we had 2 bidding offers competing against each other, and she still can't reach me. Well, the bidders now think that we don't want to sell the house at that price. So by the time I get back on the phone, the house price has literally tripled. And that was my first real estate deal. This deal here is somewhat similar in that this was slated for 196 houses to be built on this one little tract between the areas that are already developed. the developers had put $10 million into the deal. It sits there with abandoned roads and abandoned electrical outlets, et cetera. And we come along and say we want to buy it. Well, we don't have the money to buy this. And the bank says, well, we've lost so much money on it, we'll sell it to you for $2.54 million. Well, we can't find $2.54 million. We're scrambling, we're running around. But they don't know that. They think we're just ignoring their offer, that it's just too much. So now the banks come back and we're at $1 million. And so that's my approach to real estate, is that if you don't know what you're doing, maybe you can get a bargain. Okay, so I'm going to end up here telling you why I frame this in terms of fostering a restoration economy. We are involved in things that are way beyond anything I've ever done before in terms of working in the local economy, working with local ranchers, working on both sides of the border. My little company, we are an L3C, a limited profit company. We're 2 years old. We increased tenfold the first year in terms of our staff and budget. We now have 20 people working on this project, and we're doing all these things. We have a native plant nursery which generates funds and generates material for what we're doing. We're working with an eco-lodge developer to put in a facility that will provide jobs and will boost the local tourist economy. I'm not a hunter. But we just sponsored 2 quail hunts, 4 people on each came for each of 3 days. We cleared $62,000 with a quail hunt. We're involved with endangered species litigation, a whole host of activities that are employing local people, that are providing additional income to the ranchers that we're working with and the ranching families. And ranching is very much a tough, one of the standard jokes in our area is, how do you make a large fortune at ranching? I mean, how do you make a small fortune at ranching? And the answer is you start with a large fortune. And there are many examples of that in our area. This is my last slide. This is one of our primary collaborators, Gary Nabum. What we see as an emerging paradigm which is able to tap much more into private equity and investment and less dependent on philanthropy and government grants. We've been lucky to get some government grants, but we've waited 6 months for the funding to come in after we've been told we got the money because, well, you know the story. It's very difficult working in the environment of working with the agencies who don't even know their own budgets. And it's also very difficult working in private markets and trying to raise funds, but we believe we're having success at it. A big part of what we're doing is focused on keeping open lands open by diversifying the incomes of working ranching families. I very much am involved in the notion that small protected areas in large working landscapes is the way to go. And we very much believe that it's not a matter of land acquisition, it's a matter of land restoration in our part of the world. And I very much disagree with the Fish and Wildlife Director's comments yesterday that we have to accept the fact that we're going to have fewer of these species in the future. We believe we'll have more just because the area is so very degraded. The area is so degraded, there's only one way to go in terms of bringing back these resources. We also believe that by tapping into entrepreneurship and this limited profit L3C model, what's often called the slow money movement, that we will be able to do things at a larger scale. The difference being, if I go out and get $1 million from a foundation and I spend it, then I come back and ask for another $1 million. I want to go and get $1 million in the private equity market and go out and make $2 million. And so that the more we spend, the more we do, the more resources we have to do more with. We're, of course, are involved with lots of the other things that other people here are, such as branding products in local markets. So I don't see this as a paradigm which in any way replaces the good work that's already being done, but complements it and brings in resources and brings in entrepreneurship and a new way of looking at how we protect large open spaces. And we're doing this, and we're doing it on the U.S.-Mexico border in an atmosphere which is a difficult place to work. So thank you very much.
Okay, thanks Ron and Karsten and Richard. I am bringing up notes on my phone here, which is all part of planning this within 24 minutes. Okay, so I am now going to try to provoke these people by reflecting for just a minute on the various transboundary places that I have witnessed as a distant observer or visited or worked along mainly the northern boundaries of North America, and they're wildly diverse places. And so it really makes me anyway focus on this question that Richard posed at the beginning of whether we can generalize about transboundary conservation, or the alternative hypothesis that all conservation is truly local. We might have bigger brands that we create that are continental scale or truly international, Y2Y being one of them, which has been enormously successful as a brand, but as Karsten pointed out, all of those detailed conservation solutions, be they science or community-based, are much more local. So reflecting on experiences all the way from the Arctic boundary of Canada with Greenland, all the way around to the boundary between Alaska and Russia and the Bering Strait region and everything in between, including places like Great Lakes, Gulf of Maine, Salish Sea, here are my platitudinous reflective assertions to provoke you guys. So first, I think I've concluded that all conservation, or almost all conservation, is local, even international conservation. And frequently, the international border is, as Richard pointed out in his Ostrom diagram, plunked in the middle of what is basically a local or regional conservation circumstance, which makes it even more complex. So the border is real, and it really does disrupt the potential for collaboration. Sometimes the border is actually an advantage for conservation, as in the land behind the Alaska Panhandle in northwest BC, which is landlocked, doesn't have access to the coast, and as a result has made extractive economies very difficult in that place for 100 years. The border makes travel and truly shared solutions extremely hard, much more expensive, especially when you consider the very different cultures and governance circumstances that can be on either side of the border. These asymmetries are super real when you get onto the ground. All of that being said, though, the border often obscures real commonalities. Commonalities ecologically, obviously, but also commonalities of culture and language, particularly of indigenous people, which in the northern half of this continent are enormous actors in on-the-ground conservation solutions. So finally, I guess in my experience, most of what we like to call transboundary conservation is really what child psychologists call parallel play. Like when you plunk two babies on the ground here and they're 14 months old or something, they kind of each sit there and play with a rattle, but they don't really truly interact. They're playing, but not really playing with each other. And then as they grow up, this metaphor is going to bite me, I think, but as they grow up, either they become friends and form a real relationship, or they go their separate ways. And conservation often starts as parallel play with the border there, and that's not strategic and it's not intentional, it just is. and sometimes a real relationship forms, and often the parallel play continues indefinitely. So the question is, it does take a lot of extra time and effort and money to do true shared strategy. Once it happens, if you invest in getting people together, whether it's scientists or communities, and I've seen this a lot firsthand, fantastic conversations can happen. As Karsten pointed out, real creativity can be an outcome, but unless you keep that infusion of energy and cash to keep those conversations going, to keep collaborative projects going, it tends to fizzle, and one asks, was it worth it in the first place? So I guess the question I'll pose to you guys is, when should we consider active investment in non-parallel play? Under what circumstances? And should we always kind of try it first to see if it's worthwhile? Should we make investments in those conversations or those analyses? And then if we decide it's not worthwhile, then pull the plug on it and go back to our separate border side strategies. So, Richard.
Actually kick this to Karsten and sort of make a more specific question, and that is, do you feel like, after the Flathead deal has moved forward, that this really binational coalition that was working effectively for years together, do you feel that it's really fractured and has really come into this parallel play realm, and has that changed the campaign fundamentally?
The short answer is no, it hasn't fractured. I would say the Flathead Wild Team, which is a collection of groups and entities working on both sides of the border collectively under one umbrella and on a cohesive campaign that's transboundary, is, I can't share all the details at this point, but it's sort of all hands on deck, gas tanks full with jet fuel, and just gunning for some pretty big outcomes that are adding on to what's already been established. So the momentum is quite great, and that's a particular example of where, strategically at the outset, thinking about, do we just kind of each work on our pieces independently on our respective sides of the border, actually wouldn't have generated nearly the sort of leverage and outcomes of continually shifting back and forth to play, countries, provinces, states off one another.
Yeah, to follow that with... For Ron, is there some sort of bigger political imperative or sort of bigger situation that you're either trying to leverage for this hyperlocal activity, or is there something there you're really trying to get at?
Let me begin by saying two things. Can you hear me? Is this working? No? Okay, I'll speak loudly. I don't know if it's working or not. I'm going to take yours. How about this? Got to hold it. Whoa. Hold it close. Okay, I got it. Okay. Two comments. One first is we're working with multiple boundaries, not just one wall between the U.S. and Mexico. We're working with the tribal nations, and across tribal nation boundaries, we are working with very, very different attitudes, and even the ranchers in Chihuahua are very different from the ranchers that we have worked with in Sonora in terms of their attitudes. Secondly, and maybe more importantly, I think that we all individually and as organizations need to find the appropriate scale that we can work effectively at. When I left the University of Georgia and went back to Arizona 5 or 6 years ago, first thing I did is I started talking to my old friend Tom Sisk and with various people, and we were all worked up about doing something from the Sierra Madre to the Rocky Mountains. And I spent a year or two trying to get something done at that scale, and ran into many barriers that I won't bother you with, but then basically found a scale where I could be more comfortable and actually get something real that I felt was happening on the ground. Now, to many of you, maybe southeastern Arizona and northern Chihuahua and Sonora is a small area, but it's a huge area in terms of the problems on the ground and what needs to be done. And it's the scale that I feel I can comfortably work at, and And most of what we're doing now for various political and safety and other reasons has moved to the U.S. side. We're going to get done what we can when we can get it done. We need to have those collaborators across the border, and we need to have the bigger vision of how it fits together. We're so busy doing what we're doing at the relatively local scale now that if we're going to do that bigger vision and common strategy, we're going to have real funds come in and efforts to do something that will, in the long run, benefit us all, but also take away in the short run from what we can get done more locally.
This was a common theme across both of these landscapes, was that somehow we need to find this money to do the work, which is a common theme in conservation. And Ron, you brought up a very interesting thing about investment money. In restoration, sort of both in the Y2Y and in sort of Arizona, Mexico, do you feel like that can pay off and pay for itself as a mechanism to move this forward?
I don't know. I can say that so far the answer is yes. We're trying a lot of different things, some of which have resulted in real profit that we've plowed back in, and some of the things which have resulted in losses. We have proposed large funds that can move quickly to acquire key conservation areas. We're talking to a couple of investment firms about that right now, and to groups that could make that happen. But of course, they're looking at us as this tiny little group that, our office essentially is an old shed that's about 10 feet across. And we have a lot of convincing to do that we're capable of wisely using those resources. But I do think that we're making a lot of headway with investors and taking money, giving very small, slow money dividends back, and using that for good purposes.
Karsten, what do you think? Is investment a viable option? And then also, can you comment on this idea in Canada that you mentioned U.S. money coming in was a strategy, but of course there's been a backlash in Canada about U.S. U.S. funding having an undue influence. And actually, I'd like Dave to comment on that one as well. Is this a big issue in transboundary?
Yeah, I think the question for me is less about, does investment work? It's more, where is the money, where are the resources going to come for that investment? And, some market-based tools that are in the process of being worked out, I think, may have great promise for driving some funds towards restoration, particularly. And, in Canada, in Alberta right now, they're just trying to hash through, how major industrial players offset some of the damage they're doing to biodiversity in parallel appropriate landscapes. And I see that as being one wave that we definitely have to be conscious about. I think it's going to be a great tool for us. The question about money coming from the U.S. into Canada, I mean, in a way, the whole Y2Y vision just does away with that argument, because this is not about U.S. and Canadian funds. It's just about having, as a global community, the resources to seize one of these global opportunities to retain the natural values of a pretty special place. And you can also turn that around on its head and talk about global corporations and U.S. investment in Canada for business. I mean, to me, it's just sort of a ridiculous argument, and let's just get on with the work of conservation.
Yeah, can you hear me? Yeah. So I think that's right, and I think it's just another example of recognizing asymmetries in any kind of transboundary situation. So Canada just has a hell of a lot more land per capita than the United States does. It's a larger country than the US, and it has a tenth the population. So there's just going to be a lot less philanthropy. And so with any kind of strategy, the capital asymmetries will be part of it, the capacity asymmetries will be part of it, the science asymmetries will be part of it, and you just design your goals and your solutions around those things. And what they've done with the international branding, nature knows no boundaries, this isn't about the countries, it's about the landscapes, that's a great solution to that.
So
about out of time. Maybe we have time for just a couple of questions from the audience.
Hello, hello, hello. Morning. I've been waiting a long time, you guys. Soapbox. First, I want to start by thanking the organizers of the panel. I think it's great to hear about international conservation and transboundary work. Very interesting as well as yesterday. However, I want to make a comment. There are no women in the panel, and there weren't women in the panel yesterday. Don't take it personal, but somebody should take it personal. I also want to thank Dr. Ron Pulliam for addressing the Mexico-U.S. border, and especially speaking about jaguars and ocelots living in his backyard. It's really great to hear that. And linking yesterday's panel with today's panel, I will say that Dr. Pulliam showed a couple images of what the border wall looks like between our countries. And just following the suggestion yesterday, Google Rob Bishop's efforts, the enlightened congressman from the border state of Utah, who is proposing to build border walls in the northern border of the United States. It might not be a reality, but there's people who believe that that should be done, and there's people who vote for that kind of Congress people. So look for it, and while you're in your research in Google, look for Wild versus Wall, which is a very great documentary, as well as the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, about the impacts of the militarization of the border wall between Mexico and the United States. And finally, since this is a transboundary conversation, I'm curious about tribal, Aboriginal, and Native American lands. Dr. Pulliam mentioned working with some of the groups down in Arizona and Mexico, and I am curious to know from the Y2Y initiative if there is any cooperation going on, especially after the court decision in Canada about finally giving the land back to Aboriginal groups in British Columbia. Thank you.
Yes, for instance, in the Flathead, the Tanaha First Nation is one of the groups and partners that we're working with. Certainly in the U.S., a lot of our restoration efforts are in partnership with the Nez Perce and the Clearwater Forest. Salmon kind of being the catalyst for effort in releasing funds more than grizzly bears in that particular place. And as you move north in Canada, it becomes increasingly important, and sort of even more power and nests in each of the First Nations hands. Just last week, we were working with some of our partners and supporting their efforts, where they've partnered with two of the First Nations in the Yukon to try to, they did take the government to Supreme Court over the government not following due process in terms of consultation for the Peel River watershed. And that map of progress I showed you, there could be a 68,000 square kilometer blob of green up there if they do. So absolutely, the recent decision in BC, it has yet to be determined how that's going to play out. There's a lot of sort of people wrestling over what it actually means. It is specific to treaties that have not been resolved yet, and some of our partners, like in the Peace River Break, they have a resolved treaty, so we're not sure how it's going to kind of play out. But absolutely, when I say those 300 partner groups that have worked together on Yellowstone to Yukon over the last 20 years, there's literally dozens that are First Nations and Native American tribes.
Okay, maybe one more question?
Yeah, I don't think it's honest to say that humans are willing to coexist with dangerous animals like the grizzly, maybe the cougar. The proof being that we exterminated the California grizzly, and I think we should consider human-free areas for the species like that.
I can comment a little bit on that. I think some areas, you sort of think about a gradation of remoteness, if you will. Grizzly bears, I know from personal experience, having worked 18 years as a park ranger in Banff, are incredibly sort of plastic animals behaviorally. And there are individuals with a whole range of behaviors that's, as varied as all the individuals in this crowd. And there are bears out there that can coexist with humans so long as the human activity is predictable. Can all bears? Absolutely not. And for some bears, they absolutely need that seclusion. I think sort of a range of approaches and land use designations is really that. It's almost diversity of similar to how the ecosystem diversity creates resilience for the ecosystem. I think we're looking at a range of approaches to create that kind of resilience across the wide landscape as well. So I take your point. I think it's totally pertinent in some places. I know from direct experience that in some places, the Blackfoot Challenge here in Montana is another example where you still have the same number of ranchers, but now with some focused efforts to try to reduce attractants, they've basically doubled the number of grizzly bears and reduced the incidences of conflict by 90%. So I think we have a lot of progress to make in coexistence as well. Quite frankly, it's one of our themes that we work under, and I think looking ahead, it's probably going to become just ratcheted up and take importance as we move ahead here.
From the southern border perspective, there are 9 million people that live within 100 miles of the U.S.-Mexico border. We work in the area of the Sky Islands, where many of the species of greatest concern and the greatest biodiversity is in little tiny isolated segments that are separated by the valleys where millions of people live. I'm a great fan and believer in wilderness, but I also believe that wilderness alone is not going to solve our problems. We have to have wilderness. The wilderness areas in my region are tiny compared to the needs. There's a wilderness area in the Santa Ritas that's 30,000 acres, and one that's in the Huachucas that is even smaller, maybe 28,000 acres. Those are not the size of the tracts that support jaguars and even ocelots and wolves and the kind of animals we take as our icons of conservation. The only way things are going to work is we work with local communities who celebrate the fact that they live in a landscape where there are jaguars and wolves and ocelots, and they understand both the benefits and the risks that are involved. So I'm certainly not willing to give up on the non-wilderness areas.
Yeah, just to follow that a little bit, right here in the crown of the continent in Montana, just empirically, there's more grizzly bears than there were 20 years ago, and their range has expanded. And especially in places like the Blackfoot Valley and the Rocky Mountain Front, and increasingly the Swan Valley, there's greater tolerance for those bears and people figuring out how to live with less conflict. Of course, these animals need huge areas to live and to roam, but I think on the edges that we can do a better job, and we have been learning to do that, driven by conservation science and effort by people in this room, over the last, several decades. So I think it's time for coffee. So thanks to the panel, and I hope you found it interesting.